Have you ever noticed this really strange psychological quirk where humans will often choose a miserable or even actively harmful situation over one that is totally unknown?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Right. You see it everywhere. People will stay in a deeply toxic workplace for years, or, they'll remain in a terrible relationship simply because the abuse is predictable.
It's mapped territory.
Exactly. Your nervous system learns the specific rhythm of the chaos. You know exactly when your boss is going to yell or when your partner is going to give you the silent treatment. It's totally miserable, but you know the rules.
Yeah, and the alternative, just stepping out the door into absolute freedom, is completely unmapped.
And into the human brain, unmapped territory is just terrifying.
It's a profound survival mechanism, actually. We are biologically wired to prefer the devil we know. Stepping into the void requires overriding some of our most deeply ingrained neurological safety protocols. You have to actively choose terror over stagnation.
Which perfectly sets up what we are getting into today. Welcome to a brand new deep dive. Today's mission is to explore one of the most radical, boundary-pushing narratives about making that exact terrifying choice.
And it might not look like it at first glance.
No, not at all. Because we are looking at what initially might seem to a modern reader like a very standard, polite, 19th century coming-of-age autobiography. We are diving in the early chapters of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë.
Which is just a powerhouse of a text.
It really is. We have a highly curated stack of sources in front of us today. We're covering the author's incredibly fiery opening prefaces, the protagonist's traumatic early childhood at Gateshead Hall, her survival at the deeply hypocritical Lowood Institution, and her fateful, mysterious arrival at Thornfield Hall.
And I just want to say up front, we are definitely not doing a simple book club plot summary today.
No way.
We are dissecting a psychological blueprint. The sequence of these early chapters is a masterclass in how a human being constructs a self in an environment that is quite literally designed to crush them.
For those of you listening right now, you might be wondering, well, why should I care about the struggles of a fictional 19th century orphan? Why does this matter to you as you commute to work or, I don't know, fold your laundry today?
It matters more than you'd think.
Exactly. Because this text is an unparalleled survival guide. It is a manual for navigating toxic authority figures. It's about how to find and actually hold on to your own moral compass when the entire world is aggressively telling you that you are fundamentally broken.
And it's about finding the raw courage to abandon a life that is safe but spiritually dead in pursuit of genuine blood-pumping experience.
Okay, let's unpack this.
To truly grasp the explosive nature of this material, we cannot actually start with Chapter 1. We have to start with the author's warning shot.
The preface.
Right. When Charlotte Brontë published this book in 1847, she did so under the male pseudonym Currer Bell.
Which was super common back then for female authors.
Very common. And the first edition went out into the world without a preface at all. It was a massive hit, but it also drew some severe pearl-clutching criticism from the conservative establishment of the time. People claimed it was an anti-Christian book, a rebellious, improper text.
Which is wild to think about now, considering it's basically assigned reading in middle schools everywhere.
I know, right? But she didn't just ignore those critics, did she?
She absolutely did not. By the time the second edition went to print, she added a preface dedicated to the author William Makepeace Thackeray, and she's essentially took a flamethrower to her detractors.
She specifically addresses what she calls the timorous or carping few who doubted the morality of her narrative.
Timorous or carping?
Yeah.
Such great words.
Yeah, she lays out this foundational philosophical argument that basically acts as a decoder ring for the entire story. She writes, and this is a crucial quote here, "Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last."
She is drawing a massive, uncrossable line in the sand between appearance and truth.
Exactly.
I love how direct that is. It's like a modern creator making a video specifically calling out their own internet trolls, the kind of people who confuse following the superficial rules of polite society with actually being a good ethical person.
Yes. She is looking at her critics and saying, "You are wearing a mask of piety, and my entire goal is to rip it off."
And she goes even further by making a really profound accusation. She accuses Victorian society of finding it incredibly convenient to let external show pass for sterling worth. She uses this brilliant metaphor, saying society lets whitewashed walls vouch for clean shrines.
She is straight up telling the public that they are actively complicit in hiding systemic cruelty behind a veneer of manners.
I want to dig into how she defends herself here, too, because she reaches for a very specific historical and biblical justification.
Oh, the Micaiah comparison.
Right. She compares her role as an author to the prophet Micaiah from the Old Testament. For those of us who might be a bit rusty on our ancient kings and prophets, what is the context of that comparison?
It is a brilliant, highly aggressive comparison. So in the biblical account in the Book of Kings, King Ahab of Israel is surrounded by hundreds of prophets who act as total yes-men.
Just constantly flattering him.
Exactly. They tell him his military campaigns will be successful, everything he does is great, but Ahab hates the prophet Micaiah because Micaiah refuses to flatter him. Micaiah only prophesies hard, uncomfortable, disastrous truths.
So Brontë is aligning herself with Micaiah.
She is. She is arguing that plucking the mask from the face of the Pharisee, exposing the hypocrisy of the powerful, is not an insult to God or morality. It is a necessary, painful duty.
That reframes the entire purpose of the book. She's basically telling her readers, I am going to show you the ugly, rotting truth under the beautiful gilding of our society.
Yeah.
You might hate me for it, just like Ahab hated Micaiah, but you desperately need to hear it.
And this isn't just a theoretical debate she is having with literary critics. This philosophy is the exact lens through which she forces us to experience the life of our protagonist.
We are dropped immediately into the pressure cooker of Gateshead Hall.
Yeah, and we need to establish the ecosystem here. Jane is a 10-year-old orphan. She is living with her wealthy aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her 3 cousins, John, Eliza, and Georgiana.
And Jane is entirely dependent on them.
Entirely. And the reality of her day-to-day existence is systemic, relentless psychological and physical abuse.
Let's paint the picture of this household for anyone who hasn't read the book in 20 years or, maybe never picked it up. This isn't a Cinderella situation where she is just doing extra chores.
No, it is an environment of constant terror.
Primarily generated by her 14-year-old cousin, John Reed.
Oh, John.
The physical description of John is incredibly telling. Brontë describes him as a schoolboy who was large and stout for his age, with flabby cheeks and a dim eye. She explicitly states that he gorges himself habitually at the table to the point where he's bilious and unwell.
He is the physical embodiment of unearned excess and toxic entitlement.
Exactly. And his abuse of Jane is not occasional, it is chronic.
Jane notes that every nerve in her body feared him. He constantly reminds her of her precarious position. He tells her she is a dependent, that she has no money of her own, that her father left her nothing, and that she has no business using their books or living in their house.
Which brings us to the inciting incident that kicks off the entire narrative. Jane is trying to find a single moment of peace.
He just wants to be left alone.
Right. She hides behind a heavy curtain in the window seat, physically isolating herself from the family, and she is looking at a book, specifically Bewick's History of British Birds.
And the specific pages she is looking at are vital to understanding her internal state.
Because she isn't looking at pictures of, pleasant English songbirds.
Not at all. She is captivated by the introductory pages describing the bleak, solitary, death-white realms of the Arctic zone, the frozen oceans, the desolate shores.
It perfectly mirrors her own emotional landscape.
Yes, she is a child living in a frozen, isolated, desolate psychological space.
But John discovers her hiding spot. He demands she stand before him. And when she complies, he literally hurls this massive, heavy book directly at her head.
It's a horrific act of violence against a 10-year-old.
She falls. She strikes her head against the door, and she begins to bleed. And this is the moment the pressure cooker we talked about earlier finally explodes. Her terror hits an absolute ceiling, and she snaps.
She screams at him. She calls him a murderer, a slave driver, and compares him to the Roman emperors.
It is a phenomenal display of precocious intellect. I mean, a 10-year-old mapping the behavior of a domestic bully onto the tyranny of Caligula or Nero.
It shows how sharp she is. But the immediate aftermath reveals the true sickness of the Gateshead ecosystem. When Jane fights back defensively, mind you, while bleeding, who faces the consequences?
Jane does. The entire house mobilizes against her. The servants, her cousins, and Mrs. Reed immediately frame Jane as the aggressor.
They call her a fury and a picture of passion.
They physically restrain her, like she is some dangerous criminal. And Mrs. Reed orders her to be dragged upstairs and locked in the Red Room.
The Red Room is one of the most famous spaces in English literature, and for good reason.
It functions as an absolute sensory and psychological nightmare.
It really does. It is a massive, stately, silent chamber that is rarely ever used. And the color palette is overwhelming. Deep red damask curtains, a massive bed with mahogany pillars, a red carpet, and this glaring white bedspread.
It is incredibly oppressive, visually suffocating.
But the architecture and the colors aren't even the worst part. The most chilling detail, the thing that makes this literal nightmare fuel for a 10-year-old, is the history of the room.
Right. Her Uncle Reed, the man who brought her to this house, the only person who actually cared for her, breathed his last breath and lay in state in this exact room 9 years prior.
The psychological cruelty of locking a bleeding, highly distressed child in the room where her only protector died cannot be overstated.
That's just evil.
She is thrust into a space that represents death, ultimate isolation, and the complete betrayal of her uncle's dying wish. When Mr. Reed was dying, he made his wife promise to raise Jane as one of her own children. Locking Jane in that specific room is Mrs. Reed's ultimate rejection of that vow.
While she is locked in there, the sun starts going down and the room gets darker. She catches sight of herself in the great looking glass.
And she doesn't even recognize herself.
Yeah. She sees this strange little figure with a white face and glittering eyes of fear, and she thinks she looks like a phantom, a real spirit. Which forces me to pause and ask a fundamental question here. Is Jane actually a difficult child? Because the way the servants talk about her and the way Mrs. Reed treats her, you would think she is a sociopath. Is she just a bad kid, or are we looking at a completely rational reaction to an insane environment?
What's fascinating here is how the trauma of this isolation forces her young mind into a state of profound self-reflection. She possesses an agonizing level of self-awareness for a kid.
She really does.
She sits in the dark and thinks to herself, I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. A useless thing, a noxious thing. She isn't inherently wicked. She is just fundamentally incompatible with the superficial, cruel values of the Reed family.
She realizes that if she were a sanguine, brilliant, careless, romping child, even a naughty one, Mrs. Reed might have tolerated her.
Exactly. But because Jane is quiet, observant, deeply feeling, and lacks any independent wealth or social standing, she becomes the designated scapegoat for the entire household.
She is punished for her very nature. Her mind is just spinning in the dark. She wonders why she suffers so much, why she can never please anyone no matter how hard she tries.
The psychological toll is so immense that she even briefly contemplates starving herself to death just to escape.
Which is heartbreaking. And as the night deepens, superstition takes over. She starts to think that her Uncle Reed's spirit might literally rise from the graves to avenge the wrongs being done to her.
It is a textbook panic attack induced by severe trauma and sensory deprivation. She sees a sudden gleam of light moving on the wall. Objectively, it's probably just a lantern from someone walking outside.
Sure.
But in her terrified, hyper-aroused state, her brain interprets it as a herald from another world. She panics completely. She screams. She shakes the door handle. She begs for mercy.
And Mrs. Reed's reaction is just incredibly cold. She comes to the door, flanked by the servants, and she is furious that Jane is making noise. Jane is begging, saying, "Have pity. I shall be killed if I stay here."
And Mrs. Reed violently thrusts her back into the room, locks the door again, and walks away.
This pushes Jane completely over the edge. She suffers what she calls a species of fit and loses consciousness. It is a total systemic shutdown.
When she eventually wakes up, she is in her own bed, being tended to by the apothecary. She has survived the acute trauma of the Red Room, but the emotional landscape of Gateshead has been permanently altered.
She has seen the absolute bottom of Mrs. Reed's cruelty. There is no longer any illusion of family or safety to maintain.
Which sets the stage for the explosive aftermath. Once Jane recovers a bit of her physical strength, she is subjected to even more ostracization. She is told she cannot associate with her cousins.
Finally, Mrs. Reed confronts her again, trying to assert dominance. But something inside Jane has completely fractured and reset. She experiences this immense, uncontrollable surge of rebellion.
She has nothing left to lose.
Right. She looks this wealthy, powerful adult woman directly in the eye and delivers a devastating truth. She says, "I am not deceitful. If I were, I should say I loved you, but I declare I do not love you. I dislike you the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed. The very thought of you makes me sick."
It is a breathtaking dismantling of the Victorian power structure. A 10-year-old penniless orphan weaponizing the absolute truth against her wealthy guardian.
And Mrs. Reed is genuinely frightened by it. She has no idea how to handle a child who refuses to play the game of polite submission.
Jane tells her that she will let everyone know exactly how Mrs. Reed treated her, completely threatening Mrs. Reed's public image. It's the whitewash wall we discussed in the preface.
In that specific moment, Jane feels this incredible rush of freedom. It is a pure adrenaline high. Her soul expands. She feels triumphant. But Brontë includes this brilliant, deeply realistic psychological detail about the emotional hangover that follows this kind of confrontation.
The aftermath of retaliation is rarely as clean as we want it to be.
Exactly. Jane says that the vengeance felt like aromatic wine going down. It felt warm and racy and intoxicating. But the afterflavor was metallic and corroding. It left her feeling as if she'd been poisoned.
It's such an accurate description of that adrenaline crash.
If you are listening to this and you have ever finally snapped and stood up to a toxic boss or cut off a deeply abusive family member, you know exactly what that metallic aftertaste is. In the heat of the moment, you feel like a warrior. But an hour later, your hands are shaking, you feel nauseous, and the crushing reality of your isolation sets in.
You won the battle, but you are still stuck in their ecosystem, and now you are entirely alone.
And her rebellion makes her an absolute pariah. Mrs. Reed realizes she cannot control Jane anymore. Her authority has been pierced, so she decides Jane must be removed from the house entirely.
She summons an outside force to take Jane away, and this arrival introduces a character who embodies the absolute pinnacle of the hypocrisy the author warned us about.
Enter Mr. Brocklehurst, the treasurer and manager of the Lowood Institution.
Oh, Brocklehurst.
Before he even speaks, the physical description Brontë provides is just jarring. Jane walks into the drawing room and sees this straight, narrow, sable-clad shape standing erect on the rug. She literally describes him as a black pillar. She says he has a grim face at the top that looks like a carved mask.
He is the architectural embodiment of rigid, unyielding, punitive dogma. He doesn't look like a human being. He looks like a monument to institutional authority.
And his initial interaction with Jane is a masterclass in the weaponization of religion against the vulnerable. Keep in mind, he is speaking to a 10-year-old child who's recently suffered a major trauma and illness.
Right. He does not ask her how she is feeling. He does not ask about her interests. He asks her if she knows where the wicked go after death.
It is straight-up theological bullying. Jane gives the standard, orthodox answer she's been taught. She says they go to hell, which she describes as a pit full of fire.
But when Brocklehurst follows up and asks her what she must do to avoid falling into this pit of fire, her answer is so unexpectedly practical. She says, "I must keep in good health and not die."
I love that response so much.
It completely short-circuits his theological terror tactics. He expects her to say she must pray for forgiveness or submit to her elders. By giving a purely biological answer, she unknowingly highlights the absurdity of threatening a child with eternal damnation.
But Brocklehurst merely doubles down. He tells her a horrifying story about a 5-year-old child he just buried, whose soul is supposedly in heaven, heavily implying that if Jane died, her soul would face a very different destination.
He is using the concept of God as an ultimate enforcer of compliance.
He then interrogates her reading habits. He asks if she reads her Bible. She says yes, and lists the books she actually enjoys. Revelations, Daniel, Genesis, the narrative-heavy, dramatic books.
But when he asks if she likes the Psalms, she bluntly says, "Psalms are not interesting."
To which Brocklehurst immediately declares that she has a wicked heart of stone.
And Mrs. Reed sits right there and completely poisons the well.
Of course she does.
She tells Brocklehurst that Jane has many faults, but her worst fault is a tendency to deceit. She formally asks Brocklehurst to warn the teachers at Lowood to keep a strict eye on Jane.
And Brocklehurst happily accepts this narrative, promising to ensure Jane is watched closely. This effectively guarantees that Jane's fresh start at this new school will be tainted by a false reputation before she even steps foot on the grounds.
So she is shipped off to the Lowood Institution.
Let's really look at what kind of place this is. It is a charity school for orphan girls, and the conditions are nothing short of horrific.
When Jane arrives, it is the dead of winter. The water in the girls' pitchers literally freezes solid overnight, so they cannot even wash.
The clothing they are given is totally inadequate for the freezing temperatures. But the most glaring, urgent issue is the food.
The starvation at Lowood is systemic and intentional. On her very first morning, the girls are served porridge that is so badly burnt it is completely inedible. They are forced to fast until the afternoon.
The daily portions are incredibly meager, just tiny fragments of bread and thin broth. It gets to the point where the older, ravenously famished girls coerce the younger ones into giving up their tiny rations just to survive.
It's Lord of the Flies level desperation. But there is a brief moment of grace. The superintendent of the school, Miss Temple, realizes the girls have eaten nothing all day because of the burnt porridge.
She takes it upon herself to order a special lunch of bread and cheese for the entire school. It is a basic act of human decency.
But when Mr. Brocklehurst eventually visits the school and discovers this, his reaction exposes the true depth of his depravity.
He publicly and aggressively reprimands Miss Temple. He argues that replacing a spoiled meal with something edible completely neutralizes the entire aim of the institution.
He outlines his philosophy clearly. He says the goal is to render the girls hardy, patient, and self-denying. He actually weaponizes scripture to justify child abuse, quoting, "Man shall not live by bread alone."
It's sick.
He tells Miss Temple that by feeding the girls' vile bodies, she is starving their immortal souls. It is the ultimate distortion of religious doctrine to serve extreme cheapness and cruelty.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the visual contrast Brontë sets up in this specific scene is cinematic. Brocklehurst is standing in the middle of the room, lecturing Miss Temple about the necessity of mortifying the flesh.
And then he spots a girl named Julia Severn.
Right, who has naturally curly red hair. He is outraged by this display of vanity, even though the girl's hair just grows that way. He demands that all her hair be chopped off immediately to teach her shamefacedness and sobriety.
And right at the exact moment he is ordering a child to be shorn like a sheep for the sake of modesty, who sweeps into the room.
His own family. His wife and his 2 daughters arrive for a visit.
And their appearance is breathtakingly hypocritical.
They're draped in velvet, silk, and luxurious furs. The daughters are wearing gray beaver hats shaded with massive ostrich plumes and a profusion of light tresses elaborately curled.
And his wife is wearing a costly velvet shawl trimmed with ermine and, this is the best part, a false front of French curls.
It is the absolute embodiment of the whitewashed wall from the preface. Brocklehurst forces the orphans to endure freezing temperatures, starvation, and public humiliation under the guise of spiritual purity, while completely exempting himself and his family from every single rule.
It's infuriating to read.
It is perfectly analogous to a modern-day corporate CEO who slashes employee health care, cancels bonuses, and forces everyone to work grueling overtime, claiming it builds character and company grit. Meanwhile, he is flying to the office in a private jet, claiming his massive bonuses and buying his kids sports cars. The rules of suffering only apply to the powerless.
And under this crushing public tyranny, Jane experiences a terrifying realization. Brocklehurst spots her, drags her out in front of the entire school, places her on a high stool, and publicly brands her a liar and an agent of the evil one, based entirely on Mrs. Reed's false testimony.
Standing on that stool, exposed to the judgment of everyone, Jean realizes her Gateshead survival strategy is useless here.
Completely useless.
Right. At Gateshead, when she was backed into a corner, she just fought back with explosive primal anger. But if she snaps at Brocklehurst the way she snapped at Mrs. Reed or John, she will be utterly destroyed.
She will be expelled.
And as the servants at Gateshead reminded her, a penniless orphan with no home ends up begging on the streets or in the workhouse. She cannot fight this system physically. She desperately needs a new way to navigate the world.
And she finds it in the most unlikely place, a friendship with an older girl named Helen Burns.
Helen Burns represents a radically different philosophical and psychological approach to suffering. When Jane first truly observes Helen, Helen is being unfairly targeted by a particularly vicious teacher named Miss Scatcherd.
We need to explain exactly what Helen is subjected to because it is hard to read.
It really is. Miss Scatcherd forces Helen to fetch a bundle of twigs, and then she whips Helen a dozen times on the back of the neck in front of the class. And later, she forces Helen to wear a pasteboard badge on her forehead with the word slattern written on it.
For anyone unfamiliar with 19th century terminology, a slattern is a highly derogatory term for an untidy, dirty, or careless woman.
It is designed to shame her fundamentally, attacking her worth and her femininity.
But what truly shocks Jane is Helen's reaction to this abuse. Helen doesn't cry. Her face doesn't alter. She doesn't protest. She simply absorbs the whipping and the humiliation with a grave, composed firmness.
When Jane questions her about this later, while they're sitting by the fire, we get this incredible philosophical debate between a child of impulse and a child of extreme stoicism.
Jane argues for active, proportionate physical retaliation.
Jane says, when we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. so hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again. Jane operates on a very primal sense of justice. She believes you must fight fire with fire to survive.
Which is entirely logical for a child whose only experience of the world is physical and emotional warfare.
Exactly.
But Helen counters this with an almost otherworldly philosophy. She tells Jane that it is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to bear. She references the teachings of the New Testament, specifically Christ's mandate to love your enemies and endure persecution patiently.
Helen says, life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity or registering wrongs.
Such a heavy thing for a kid to say.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener. Because if you hear Helen's advice today, just accept the abuse, don't fight back, focus on heaven, it sounds like terrible, potentially dangerous advice. Isn't Helen's philosophy just a massive trauma response?
That's a very fair modern read.
We are talking about an impoverished charity case in a starvation-level institution. She has absolutely zero physical agency. She cannot fight back against an adult teacher armed with a bundle of twigs. Isn't this entire philosophy of spiritual endurance just a psychological survival mechanism, a way for her brain to cope with total helplessness?
It certainly functions as a coping mechanism for a child in an impossible situation. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of Jane's development, Helen's perspective is a vital evolutionary step.
How so?
Well, Jane is entirely consumed by her anger. She remembers every single injustice with crystal clarity. The resentment is eating her alive. Helen introduces Jane to the concept of separating the criminal from the crime.
How does she explain that to Jane?
Helen tells her, I can so clearly distinguish between the criminal and his crime. I can so sincerely forgive the first while I abhor the last. Helen is teaching Jane that while her body might be a prisoner to Miss Scatcherd or Mr. Brocklehurst, her mind does not have to be.
Ah, I see.
Helen explains that when she's being berated, her mind simply roves away. She dreams of her home in Northumberland, or she ponders the historical nuances of King Charles I.
She retreats into the impenetrable fortress of her own intellect.
Exactly. She is showing Jane that true inner intellectual freedom can exist even in physical captivity. You do not have to let your abuser colonize your mind.
That is a staggering lesson for Jane. And we see the immediate practical power of Helen's presence. When Jane is standing on that stool of infamy, publicly branded a liar, she feels like she's going to suffocate from the shame.
But then Helen walks past her.
Right. Helen lifts her eyes and gives Jane a single calm smile. Jane says it was like a martyr or a hero passing a slave and imparting strength. That one look of true intellectual courage from Helen allows Jane to master her hysteria. She doesn't scream or faint like she did in the Red Room. She stands firm.
But the grim reality of Lowood's physical conditions ultimately overrides any intellectual victories. As the harsh, freezing winter finally breaks and the spring month of May arrives, turning the grounds of Lowood into a beautiful, flowery woodland, a horrific typhus epidemic sweeps through the school.
Let's contextualize this for a moment. Typhus is a disease historically associated with extreme overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition. It thrives in exactly the kind of environment Brocklehurst created. Out of the 80 girls at the school, 45 fall severely ill.
The juxtaposition Brontë creates here is haunting.
It really is.
The outside world is bursting into life. The garden is glowing with roses and tulips, the days are bright and warm. But inside the walls of Lowood, the rooms are steaming with hospital smells, and girls are dying in devastating numbers.
And amidst this chaos, Helen Burns is dying. But she isn't dying of typhus. She's dying of consumption.
For those who might not know, consumption was the 19th century term for tuberculosis.
Right. It was a disease that slowly wasted the body away, and it was heavily romanticized in the Victorian era as a good death because the mind usually stayed sharp until the end. Jane sneaks into Miss Temple's room in the middle of the night to see Helen one last time.
The death scene is profoundly moving because Helen is completely devoid of fear. She is entirely at peace with her philosophy. She tells Jane not to grieve, that she is escaping a life of great sufferings, and that she feels absolute certainty she is going to God.
She falls asleep, peacefully, resting her head on Jane's shoulder, and she never wakes up.
It is a devastating loss for Jane, but Brontë leaves us with a powerful final detail about Helen's legacy.
For 15 years, Helen's graves in the Brocklebridge churchyard is nothing but a grassy mound. But eventually, a gray marble tablet is placed there. We can infer Jane placed it there as an adult, and the tablet only has her name and a single Latin word, resurgam.
I shall rise again. It is the ultimate vindication of Helen's philosophy of enduring hope. Her body was destroyed by the institution, but her spirit and her impact on Jane proved indestructible.
The tragedy of the typhus outbreak does have one positive outcome, though. The massive death toll leads to a public investigation.
Finally.
The horrific conditions of Lowood, the starvation diet, the fetid water, the freezing rooms, are exposed to the public. Wealthy benefactors in the county are outraged. They step in, a new building is erected in a healthier location, and Brocklehurst's absolute power is stripped away.
He is sidelined by a committee of more sympathetic men. The school actually transforms into a genuinely good place of learning.
And Jane benefits from this transformation. She finds stability. We experience an 8-year time jump here. Jane stays at Lowood for 6 years as a pupil and then for 2 years as a teacher.
She excels. She becomes highly educated, skilled in French, drawing, and music. She has achieved security.
But security, as we are about to learn, isn't enough for a hungry mind. This brings us to a massive psychological transition. Jane is 18 years old, and the stabilizing force in her world, her beloved mentor, Miss Temple, gets married and leaves Lowood.
The departure of Miss Temple acts as a catalyst. Jane notes that from the moment Miss Temple's carriage disappears over the hill, her entire perspective shifts.
She realizes that all the serene, well-regulated, dutiful feelings she thought were her own were actually just borrowed from Miss Temple's atmosphere.
She calls Miss Temple her prop, and with the prop gone, Jane is forced to stand entirely on her own.
She goes to her window, looks out past the school grounds to the distant blue peaks, and she has this profound realization. She realizes she is in a prison. Yes, it is a safe, polite, well-fed prison now, but it is still a prison ground. Her entire universe consists of school rules, school duties, and school faces.
This is an incredibly important moment of internal awakening. She desires liberty. She says she literally gasps for it. She wants to see the world, to interact with different minds.
But she is practical.
Very. She realizes that absolute liberty is impossible for a penniless woman without family. So she frames a humbler supplication. She asks the universe for a new servitude.
A new servitude. That is such a striking, almost contradictory phrase.
It really is.
She knows she belongs to the working class. She knows she has to exchange her labor for survival. She isn't asking to be a wealthy heiress. She is just desperately asking for a change of scenery. She wants a new place, new faces, new circumstances. Even if she is still serving, she wants the agency to choose her master.
And this leads to one of the most radical, deeply feminist internal monologues in all of 19th century literature. Jane is essentially speaking directly to the reader about the human condition.
Yes, the passage where she looks out over the landscape and meditates on the nature of ambition.
She says, "Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer."
That is Charlotte Brontë stepping out from behind the curtain and speaking directly against the Victorian societal cage.
100%.
It is a total refutation of the era's prevailing ideology that women were naturally passive, domestic creatures who should be perfectly satisfied with making puddings, knitting stockings, and playing the piano. Brontë is arguing that the human need for action, for intellectual stimulation, for a wider field of effort, is not a gendered trait. It is a universal human requirement.
She goes on to say that it is narrow-minded for more privileged members of society to say that women ought to confine themselves to making shirts and roasting dinners, and that it is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex.
It is a phenomenal manifesto, and it is so relatable today.
Oh, absolutely.
If you are listening to this right now, think about that terrifying but totally exhilarating moment when you realize you have fundamentally outgrown your environment. Maybe it is your hometown, where everyone knows exactly who you were in high school.
Or a job you've been at too long.
Right. Maybe it is a safe entry-level job that you could do in your sleep, or a long-term relationship that is perfectly comfortable but completely devoid of passion. It is the moment you realize that a perfectly safe routine is actually just a very comfortable coffin.
You realize that to stay alive mentally, you have to get out, even if the only way out is stepping into the absolute unknown.
So Jane takes proactive, decisive action. She doesn't wait for a savior. She writes an advertisement offering her services as a governess, walks 2 miles to the nearest town in the pouring rain just to mail it, and eventually lands a job at a place called Thornfield Hall.
Which brings us to the final act of today's deep dive. Jane packs her trunk, leaves the only world she has known for 8 years, and travels to Thornfield,
But when she arrives, the reality of the place immediately shatters all her preconceived expectations of what this new servitude will look like.
She expects to be met by a rigid, aristocratic grand dame who will treat her with the usual cold contempt Victorian society reserved for governesses. Instead, she is greeted by Mrs. Fairfax, who is this cozy, chatty, elderly lady sitting by the fire knitting.
Jane quickly discovers that Mrs. Fairfax isn't the owner of the estate, she is merely the housekeeper.
Right, the actual owner is a mysterious Mr. Rochester, who is apparently almost never there. He just travels constantly.
And Jane's pupil isn't some stiff English aristocrat. She is a flighty, lively, French-speaking little girl named Adele Varenne, who is Rochester's ward. The whole setup is deeply unorthodox.
And the physical environment of Thornfield Hall itself is heavily atmospheric and deeply unsettling.
It is a grand, sprawling manor house, but it feels neglected. The lower floors are kept in pristine condition for an owner who never visits. But when Mrs. Fairfax gives Jane a tour of the upper levels, the tone shifts drastically.
Mrs. Fairfax takes Jane up to the third floor, and the description here gives off massive Bluebeard's castle vibes. The rooms are full of antique furniture that looks hundreds of years old. Jane describes it as a home of the past, a shrine of memory.
The corridor is narrow and dim, and while Jane is pacing this spooky third-floor hallway, she hears a sound that completely chills her.
A laugh.
Yes, it is a laugh, but it's not a normal, happy laugh. Jane describes it as a distinct, formal, mirthless laugh. It is tragic and preternatural.
When Jane, deeply unsettled, asks what that sound was, Mrs. Fairfax dismissively attributes it to a sewing servant named Grace Poole.
And then Grace Poole actually emerges from one of the locked doors.
Yeah.
She is a square-made, red-haired, hard-featured woman who looks incredibly mundane and commonplace.
It is such a jarring disconnect. You have this eerie, Gothic, ghostly laugh echoing down a dark corridor, and the explanation is just a grumpy sewing lady with a pint of porter.
Jane accepts the explanation, but the unease lingers. However, she settles into her routine. Months pass. She teaches Adele, she chats with Mrs. Fairfax, and the profound stagnation she feared starts to creep back in.
Which sets the stage for the crucial climax of our analysis. It is a freezing January afternoon. The ground is hard, the air is still. Jane volunteers to walk 2 miles to the village at Hay to post a letter.
She walks to the top of a hill, sits on a stile, and watches the sun go down and the moon rise. The silence is absolute. She's completely alone in the world.
Until that absolute silence is broken by a metallic clatter.
She hears a horse approaching on the dark lane, and Jane's mind, fueled by the isolation, the twilight, and the eerie atmosphere of her life at Thornfield, recalls one of the old nursery tales the servant Bessie used to tell her back at Gateshead.
She thinks of a north of England folklore spirit called a Gytrash.
We should explain the Gytrash as it sets the psychological tone for the encounter. In regional folklore, the Gytrash is a goblin spirit that haunts solitary travelers. It typically takes the form of a beast, horse, a mule, or a large, terrifying dog.
And right on cue, as she is remembering this ghost story, a great dog with a huge head and a lion-like mane glides out from under the hazel stems in the dark.
Jane's heart jumps. It looks exactly like the demonic dog from the stories.
But then the horse follows behind it, and on the back of the horse is a rider, a human being.
And Jane immediately relaxes. She thinks, okay, the spell is broken. Spirits don't ride horses. It's just a traveler.
But then the mundane reality violently interrupts the quiet evening. The horse slips on a sheet of solid ice covering the causeway. With a massive clattering tumble, both the massive horse and the rider go down hard on the frozen ground.
The man is swearing heavily. He is struggling to get his foot free from the stirrup, and his giant dog is barking wildly at the moon. So what does this all mean? Think about how brilliantly Brontë subverts the classic expected knight in shining armor trope here.
It is a total deconstruction of romantic conventions.
Exactly. I mean, think about a traditional fairy tale or a standard Victorian romance. The dashing, impeccably dressed, handsome knight rides in on a white stallion to rescue the helpless, stranded governess from the dark woods. But here,
the supposed knight slips on a patch of ice and faceplants right in front of her.
He is swearing, he is groaning in pain, he isn't conventionally handsome. Jane specifically notes he has a dark face, stern features, and a heavy brow. And most importantly, Jane is not a damsel in distress in this scenario. She is the capable one offering assistance.
It completely inverts the societal power dynamic from the very first second they meet. The traveler's gruff and clearly annoyed by his own vulnerability. He tries to wave her away, telling her she ought to be at home.
But Jane is entirely unintimidated by his frown and his roughness.
In fact, she makes a fascinating psychological observation here. She notes that if he had been a handsome, heroic-looking, smiling young gentleman, she would have been far too shy to insist on helping him. She would have felt inadequate. But his grumpiness, his lack of conventional grace, actually sets her completely at ease.
She stands her ground. She firmly tells him, "I cannot think of leaving you, sir, at so late an hour in this solitary lane till I see you are fit to mount your horse." She is asserting her agency. She refuses to be dismissed.
And because his sprain is severe, he has no choice. He literally has to lean heavily on her shoulder, this tiny 18-year-old penniless governess, just to limp back to his horse and hoist himself into the saddle.
He takes his whip, spurs his horse, and vanishes into the night without so much as a polite thank you or goodbye.
It establishes a relationship based entirely on mutual, rough utility. There is no polite, flowery Victorian courtship here. It is raw, practical, slightly antagonistic, and entirely real.
And when Jane finally walks back to Thornfield Hall and goes into the house, she sees that same giant Guy Trash-like dog sitting comfortably by the fire. She asks the servant whose dog it is, and the servant replies, "He came with Master, Mr. Rochester. He has just arrived."
The fallen, swearing traveler on the ice was her mysterious employer.
And this encounter marks the definitive end of her stagnation. She reflects on the event, noting that it was an incident of no romance, yet it marked with change one single hour of a monotonous life.
Her help had been needed and claimed. She had acted. She had stepped out of the prison of routine and engaged directly with the unpredictable world.
We have traced an absolutely incredible psychological arc today. We started with a terrified, emotionally shattered 10-year-old girl locked in a haunted red room, literally bleeding from a thrown book.
We watched her become a fiery rebel, screaming truth at the hypocritical authority figures trying to crush her.
We saw her navigate the starvation of Lowood and learn the profound power of inner intellectual endurance from Helen Burns.
And we followed her as a self-determined 18-year-old who actively orchestrated her own escape, placed an ad in a paper, and stepped out into the freezing unknown to demand real experience.
It is the profound, ongoing journey of a mind refusing to be crushed by conventionality. It is the story of a human being demanding her absolute right to exist, to feel, and to act on her own terms.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, the listener, directly, look at your own life. Where are you accepting a whitewashed wall?
Where are you smiling and nodding at hypocrisy or mistreatment just because it is dressed in velvet and speaks with the voice of authority?
And where might you need to seek your own new servitude? Where do you need to take that terrifying step out of a comfortable coffin, out into the unmapped territory to ensure you actually keep growing?
Finding the answer to that requires the courage to scrutinize and expose the base metal beneath the gilding, precisely as Brontë warned us we must do in her preface.
It requires being the prophet Micaiah in your own life.
Yeah.
Telling the hard truths. But I want to leave you with a lingering mystery to ponder. Think back to that strange, mirthless, eerie laugh echoing from the dark third-floor corridor of Thornfield Hall.
Jane is told it is just an eccentric sewing servant named Grace Poole.
But we have just spent an hour dissecting a world where appearances constantly deceive. A world where polite conventionality masks cruel abuse, where religious charity masks systemic starvation, and where a grand manor house feels like a lonely prison. In a world built on profound deception, what else might be hidden behind the polite, heavy oak doors of respectable society? The dollhouse looks absolutely perfect from the outside, but inside, the pressure is building. Keep an ear out for the laugh.